I've enjoyed the book substantially. I want to give you a chance to tell the audience a little about who you are and kind of how you got here. And you sort of fell into studying human behavior a little backwards, right? So you worked for the Israeli Defense Forces. Your family escaped from the Nazis in France in World War II. And did that ignite a passion to study human beings?
We had a passion to study human beings from an early age. I mean, there are some people who know from an early age what they're going to do, and I think I did. So
Okay.
I was lucky that way.
Yeah. But you had these experiences that catalyzed this.
Well, yes, I had a number of experiences, but it's after something happens, then you remember those experiences that fit, and you think they catalyzed it. So I'm not really sure what they catalyzed, but which experience do you want me to tell about?
Well, I think working with the Israeli Defense Forces, I mean, you tell us a little about that.
I can do. I was in an academic unit within the Israeli Defense Forces, which means that, like in the ROTC, I was allowed to do my studies first and to do my service later, doing my officer training in summers. And so I served as an infantry platoon commander for a year, and then I was a psychologist. And actually, that really shaped my career. And there were two incidents that I tell in the book, but I'll tell one of them because it's really quite basic to what happened to me later. And it's the story of how we were trying to select candidates for officer training school. And there was a test that we inherited from the British Army. It was called the Leaderless Group Test, and it was done in an obstacle course. I still remember it as a very hot and sweaty day. I mean, hot and sweaty days, this is Israel, and can get quite hot. You bring 8 candidates for that job, you face them, they'd be facing a wall. There would be a telephone pole there, you tell them, pick up the pole. And then you tell them that they had a mission, and their mission was to get to the other side of the wall without the pole touching either the ground or the wall, and without any of them touching the wall. It can be done. It's hard. It's hard, it's heavy, it's sweaty, and they're leaderless. I mean, somebody has to take over, and others have to help him, and there is competition. And there were 2 people observing this, and the very striking thing about observing this was that we immediately had a sense that we were seeing their true natures revealed. It was an intensely stressful situation. You could see the leaders, you could see the wimps, you could see the people who were not very nice, you could see the good followers. It was all extremely obvious who those people were. We really had no hesitation at all. And later, when we were supposed to give a grade as to predict how they would do in officer training school, there wasn't much doubt either, because we just had seen what kind of leaders they would be. But then the story gets complicated, because every few weeks we would get feedback. We'd get statistical feedback on the relationship between the grades that were given and what actually happened to those people in officer training school, to those that were sent there. And it was always the same. We just couldn't do a thing. I mean, all our judgments had virtually nothing to do with what happened to those people in graduate training school. So this is one of many situations where people think they can do something that clearly they can't do. But where the story struck me was, this being the army, so you learn one afternoon that what you're doing is worthless, and the next morning they bring in the next batch of recruits. You have to take them to the obstacle field, and you give them a pole, and they face the wall. And 5 minutes later, you're seeing their true natures revealed. So that knowing the statistical knowledge that this was a task we couldn't perform in no way affected our subjective sense of confidence in the judgments we made the following day about the new candidates. We just knew who was going to be a leader. So there was that very odd thing of knowing something, and also at the same time knowing that what you know is nonsense. And that's actually, I think that's how I became a professional psychologist, because I invented a word, which is what psychologists do. I call that the illusion of validity, because it was like an illusion where you see something, you know that what you're seeing isn't right, but you go on seeing it that way. And so that was a formative experience a long time ago.
Friedrich Hayek called this the fatal conceit, this idea that we can actually understand and control these highly organic systems made up of human beings. So what you've just said now reminds me of the kind of financial crisis. There's this conceit that we can design these systems that we really understand at a fundamental level how they will behave dynamically, and yet we don't. So you attribute this to what you call System 1 and System 2 in the brain. So tell us a little about System 1 and System 2.
We have the illusion that we understand the world. I mean, it's bigger than the illusion of validity. There is an illusion of understanding. We think the world is knowable to a much greater extent than it really is. And here, sort of, my source, I very much like the work of Nassim Taleb and Black Swans and his emphasis on the radical uncertainty that we're facing with. But there is something going on which is pernicious and which I think influences also our notions about intuition. And this is, we say, there are people who knew that there was going to be a crisis. And quite a few people now think they knew that there was going to be a crisis. Well, nobody knew that there was going to be a crisis. I think this word should be taken out of the vocabulary completely in contexts such as these. Nobody knew. Some people thought there would be a crisis. Then there was a crisis, and now we say they knew it. And because we only say that people know something when we happen to know that it is true. This is pernicious, because saying that people knew something before it happens suggests that it was knowable. And when you realize that there were people who were just as bright and just as well informed and just as motivated who didn't think there was going to be a crisis, and you remember that and you put them on an equal footing, it changes your view of what is knowable and what is not knowable. And all of this is part of that intuitive system of, intuitive system 1, that when something happens that in any way you anticipated, you think you knew it. We think we knew things we didn't anticipate. That's called hindsight, so we make a lot of mistakes of that kind. And all of that happens not deliberately, and it's not showing off or anything like that. This is the way our mind works. Our mind explains events as soon as they happen. And then we are sure that we understand them, and we're sure that we can predict how they'll behave in the future. And neither of these quite often is true. Long answer, sorry.
Part of this is because the brain is a meaning-making machine, and we work very hard to fit pieces together and tell a coherent story. And we do that very rapidly. So this System 1 in the brain you identify as being sort of blunt, rapid system that tries to fit everything together. And sometimes you have to actively engage System 2 in tasks that are cognitively difficult. Talk about your early studies on pupil dilation, these measures of how hard the brain is working to solve these particular problems.
Yeah, there is one system that really works sort of effortlessly, and that's System 1. That's its main characteristic, is that what happens is automatic, and we experience the mental products as things that happen to us. So, when you look at me, you're not deliberately constructing an image of me. It happens to you. A word appears on the screen, you read it, you don't intend to read it, it happens to you. So there is a whole set of things. And as you drive, when you're driving and nothing particularly eventful happens, it happens to you. You're not doing anything in particular. And indeed, you can conduct a conversation at the same time. Then there is what I call System 2, which is basically just the family of operations, of mental operations that demand effort. And they are deliberate, and we have a sense of authorship and agency when we engage in those things. And then there is an interesting interplay between System 1 and System 2, which sort of defines the way the mind works, as I describe it. This is just a description, it's a metaphor. There are no two systems in the brain that interact in this way. It's just a lot easier to understand what's going on if you use that metaphor. It's clear that if you spread attention more widely, you experience the world differently, and it's very clear that there are cultural differences. So that seems to be, there's a strong suggestion that there are differences between Eastern cultures and Western cultures on that dimension, that we tend to focus on details and are less sensitive to the periphery, and people in a different context. Chinese, for example, are better at remembering what's in the periphery of the field, and they're not equally focused on what's at the center of the field. And some people have speculated this has something to do with individualist culture and collectivist cultures, where people are just more attuned to what other people think.
So in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, you identify System 2, this effortful cognitive system, as being lazy. And that is, that it prefers System 1 to kick in, work automatically if I don't really have to. So I'm wondering if there are some practices that Westerners might do, for example, mindfulness meditation, that might, again, widen that scope.
I don't know, I've been asked this question, and I then realized that I haven't thought about it, so I don't have an intelligent answer to what meditation does. I tried to learn meditation and I failed. So
Me too.
I'm a failed meditator. So I don't know what it does, but it clearly cultivates that sense of letting more things in.
Right.
And at the same time, what it cultivates very clearly is a control over emotions. So there is a control. You distance yourself from what is happening to you. And so there are many things that it alters. How that could translate into everyday living and so on, that I have no idea.
Okay. So why would evolution evolve this kind of lazy brain system?
Well, it's not that everything that happens in evolution has a purpose. I mean, something are in process, something are in progress, something are sort of artifacts of other things that are happening. So this system too, evolutionarily, is a sort of late invention. I mean, this whole business of the frontal lobes and controlling yourself and monitoring yourself, all of this is a recent invention. System 1, as I describe it, is really an outgrowth of perception. It's something that much of it is shared with lower animals. And then grafted on it is a linguistic ability, because our intuitive system, fast thinking, understands language. But it is really like a perceptual machinery. It interprets the world, but it interprets the world without having to verbalize it very much.
Right. And without nuance.
And without.
Right.
Well, that I think
Okay.
is not true.
Okay.
Nuance. All our world knowledge, I mean, our skills are System 1, because driving is a skill. I use a lot the example that I'm very skilled at recognizing my wife's mood from the first word on the telephone. And, all of you have that skill in one way or another. That comes from a lot of reinforced practice. And so that has become automatic, and it has become intuitive, and I have no idea, what makes me recognize it. So there is, a great deal of that is happening. Now I've lost where I was going.
Nuance, if System
Yeah.
1 is nuanced or not.
But System 1, or associative memory, is the repository of our world knowledge, and it retrieves world knowledge with incredible efficiency. The stories that I read while writing the book, one of those that impressed me most is, I wish I could mimic it, because it's a story about an upper-class male voice, which says the sentence, "I have large tattoos all down my back." And within about 3/10 of a second, there is a reaction in the brain, and the reaction is a clear signature of surprise. There is an incongruity. People who speak with upper-class British voices don't have large tattoos in their back. And we recognize that at enormous speed. Now think what it takes. It takes identifying the voice, the social class of the voice, what you know about the social class, and detecting that it doesn't fit. A simpler one is a male voice saying, "I think I'm pregnant." And males don't become pregnant. So all of that, there's a lot of nuance there. And actually, nuance, I think, is in system one. The one that is lacking nuance is system two. That has nuance, creativity, the odd symbolic links between things. They are unconscious or largely unconscious, and they are the way that system one works, very much without awareness.
Okay.
I think that's where nuance sits, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. It's become fashionable to say human beings are irrational. You want to weigh in on that debate?
Yeah, don't get me in on it.
Go for it.
I don't like the word irrational, and I don't like the whole emphasis on irrationality. I think historically what happens is that the word rational was hijacked by economists and decision theorists, and to some extent philosophers, to mean something quite specific. There are axioms of rational choice, axioms of rational belief, and if your beliefs conform to those axioms, then you're a rational being. Now, it is impossible for any finite mind to satisfy those axioms. They are completely unfeasible. And so, and yet, it is quite important for economics to use the idea that people are rational in that sense. It simplifies the mathematics and it simplifies a lot of the treatment. So mathematics is to a very large, economics is based on an unrealistic theory of economic agents, which assigns to them a degree of rationality that is completely unfeasible. Now here come psychologists, Amos Tversky and myself at a certain stage, and we say no, people are people, their minds are finite, they are not rational in that sense. The next thing that happened, we are called prophets of irrationality. But irrationality, in the language, to be rational basically means to be reasonable. We never said that people are not reasonable. Irrationality means frothing at the mouth. We never said that people froth at the mouth.
Good.
So I think the debate has been distorted and sensationalized to emphasize irrationality. What happens is reasonable people make interesting mistakes. And that is because they have a finite mind and they have a system one and they have a lazy system two. And in interaction, they make predictable mistakes. They're still reasonable.
One of the nice things about the book that you do is at the end of each chapter, you provide specific ways to help System 1 and System 2 work better, as to how to get over the biases that we all have. Evolutionarily, developmentally, we have a bunch of biases in the way we think that you have articulated in your work. Can you use System 2 to be less biased in your judgments?
Those bits at the end of chapters, there are sentences in which some terms are used. And I should explain what I did in this book, which I think makes it a bit harder to read than many other books on the same subject, so I might as well warn you. There is one thing that writers of sort of trade books, academics who write trade books, are terrified of sounding as if, of reminding people that they once were in school. You don't want to write a textbook. You don't want to remind people that here somebody's trying to teach you something. And as a result, people who write books quite often introduce terms and concepts, but they never use them again. Because they don't want to assume that you have memorized chapter 3 when you're reading chapter 4. That's what they used to do, you used to do when you were in college. You're not supposed to do it again. This is a little more textbook-like in the sense that I would like people to acquire a language, as much of a language as possible. I think that acquiring a language is very important in learning to think. And that if you have a well-differentiated language to think about judgment and decision-making, as I say, you will be a more intelligent gossiper. And educating gossip is really the aim of the book. That you will not, that I can tell you, from 45 years of experience studying intuition. My intuition is no better than it used to be. My System 1 is just the same as it was. I am capable of detecting mistakes. or rather of detecting situations where mistakes are likely. I am fairly poor at detecting my own mistakes because I'm too busy making them to have the spare capacity to detect them. I'm pretty good at detecting other people's mistakes. And this is really the idea of the book, is to enable you to detect other people's mistakes. Don't try to learn from it too much about how to think. But if you think better about how other people think, ultimately that will reflect. And that's the idea of the book.
And I think, having that language is very important. You give an example of a court case in which the lawyers may want to settle, and you present to the judge a particular offer, $100,000 to settle. And now you've anchored that whole discussion around that. And you say one thing you suggest, for example, when you teach business students is not only to say, well, no, we prefer $1 million, is actually get angry and actually walk away. Don't even let that anchor, fit into the way people are thinking.
Anchoring is an interesting effect. It's described in the book. The idea is that once a number has entered a conversation, the number just sits there and becomes more plausible by virtue of having been mentioned. And that is sometimes pernicious in negotiations. And sometimes you just don't want to have a negotiation across a huge gap by presenting an equally unreasonable number. You just want to shut the first number out. I'm not going to negotiate on this basis. It's one way, when you recognize that this is happening to you, this is something that you can decide to do. I suggest that make a scene and just say, I will not negotiate on the basis of that number. It's an example.
I think you describe in the book these beautiful experiments in which the number can be pulled out of the air. So they have this Wheel of Fortune experiment you did in which students spin a wheel, they get a number, and then you ask them some sort of trivial fact, and whatever number they spun to ends up affecting their answer to how cold is it in Berlin in July. So knowing that, it's still hard to suppress that. And so that's, I think, where the kind of rubber hits the road, which is, okay, we're biased, there's a number out there, we can't help but kind of anchor to it. And yet knowing that, how do I step away? How do I make better decisions?
Well, I think it's fairly difficult. Anchoring is not too bad. I'll give you one example of what Paul meant. That was a study done on German judges in an experiment, and they tossed two dice. And the dice were rigged to show either 3 or 9. And those judges previously had read a detailed case about a shoplifter. And then they were asked a question, which is the kind of question they answer for a living. How long should that person go to jail for? How many months? The first question was, should she go to jail more or less than the number that was just shown on your 2 dice? The people who showed 3 averaged about 5 months. The people who saw 9 averaged about 8 months. So they knew it was random, but they could not really help being influenced by it. Very difficult to resist anchoring, unless you really make, like making a scene or deciding this number is a lie. And otherwise it's very difficult. It's much easier to see that somebody else is being anchored. And that's...
Mm-hmm. We're in a downtown business audience, so this suggests to me that in many situations I could either reverse engineer this process. I could put a number on the table which I know is completely false, but we're still stuck with it as an anchor. Or it also suggests that in many business negotiations there's going to be money left on the table because of these biases in the way System 1 and System 2 work.
There are certainly biases that make successful negotiations difficult. Anchoring may create a bias, and it makes agreement somewhat more difficult to reach because quite frequently people start too far from each other and too long a distance. The real hang-up in negotiation is what is called concessions. Concessions are something that I give up, that I feel I have, it's part of my endowment, and I give it up. People hate making concessions. And it's quite interesting that you could negotiate over the final terms of the agreement, or you could negotiate on changes relative to the previous contract. And in some interesting ways, negotiating on changes is harder than negotiating on the final shape of a contract. Because the concessions hurt me, and you don't get much pleasure from my concessions. Your concessions hurt you, and they don't give me enough pleasure. And it's that discrepancy, we call it loss aversion, that creates a lot of difficulties in negotiation. So many of the things that we talk about show up, in the real world. But you have to be able to slow down to recognize them, and to use that language, because without using the language, you don't recognize them.
So system 1 is aggressive. It wants to be in charge unless you get system 2 engaged?
Well, it's not so much that it's what it wants. It is continuously active. And system 2 mostly, system 2 is also active. And we don't do whatever comes to mind. There is a monitoring, there is some control, that's a system 2 activity. But being lazy, system 2 is inclined to endorse the suggestions of system 1, and doesn't distinguish very clearly between the biases. Like, for example, a speaker comes out and is attractive. Now, you're not going to judge the quality of the speech by how handsome the speaker is, but you're going to be affected by it. That is, there is a bias. That effect of attractiveness is a system 1 effect. Then on top of that, there are judgments generated by system 2, but they don't correct the initial bias. So the bias is there. And that is the way it very often works.
And we know that people judge as more good looking, make more money, as do tall people, good for me.
Tall people.
So we have these built-in biases because presumably in our evolutionary history, at some point, tall people were more productive or something. We're stuck with that bias.
Well, there are those marvelous studies of people's reactions to photographs. You show a pair of photographs. Actually, the collection of photographs were the campaign photographs of candidates for congressmen, people who ran for Congress. You show those two pictures for 1/10 of a second, really and you ask, who is more competent? That predicts 70% of the races. So we are very, it's a judgment that by evolution we have learned to make instantly, which is how competent people are, how dangerous they are. We do that by the expression on the face, and how strong they are and dominant, and we do that by their chin and by other clues. But that is clearly wired in evolution. We don't control it, and it biases our judgments of people, including our voting decisions, and people are completely unaware that this is happening to them.
And things like judgments of trustworthiness, and we just do that almost instantly. And yet, if we don't trust other people, then we can't live around the other humans, right? We're social creatures. So I'm wondering if our social nature affects the way System 1 and System 2 work. Would those be different if we weren't such social creatures?
Well, a lot of our social nature is built into System 1. So we have those responses to competent people. We have a lot of our emotion is built into System 1, including trust and including, love and emotion that you have studied. They start, they're not judgments. They're not generated by conscious evaluation of whether something is good or bad. It is something that starts from the chemistry and the brain structure. It's System 1.
A lot of your current work has been looking at well-being, how people are satisfied with their lives, and including a really beautiful paper just a couple months ago showing that acute happiness has a peak. It's around $75,000 a year. After that income level, people don't have any more direct happiness, and yet their life satisfaction continue to go up.
Yeah. For the last 10 or 15 years, actually, I've been engaged in studying well-being, and I'm particularly curious about a distinction between two features of well-being. One is how you feel about life as you're going through life. It's the emotional tone of your experience, and that's experience happiness. And the other is how do you feel about your life when you think about your life. which is completely different. That is when you're asked to evaluate your own life. And it turns out that very different things make you emotionally happy and make you satisfied with your life. What tends to make people emotionally happy is largely social. It has, to a very surprising extent, the amount of time you spend with people who love and who love you really determines that part of life. Life satisfaction is different. And we looked, the economist Angus Deaton, my colleague at Princeton, and I, we looked at the effects of income on life satisfaction and on experience happiness. Now, it's miserable to be poor, emotionally miserable to be poor. By the way, more in the United States than in many other countries. It is terrible to be poor. Everything is worse when you're poor. Divorce is worse, an illness is worse, being lonely is worse. So, experience happiness rises with income up to, and that surprised us greatly, a household income of roughly $70,000 in expensive places. I mean, it's not that in New York it's 150. It's about $70,000, which is not very high. Beyond that, it's absolutely flat. Life satisfaction goes on rising. Why is it flat? We don't know yet, but there is a very interesting suggestion, possibility, which is that beyond a certain income, clearly people are able to buy more pleasures when they have more income, but they lose something on the other side. They may lose some ability to enjoy the small pleasures of life, and that seems to balance out. So that lack of money buys you misery, that's for sure. Money doesn't buy you emotional happiness beyond, an amount that is fairly easily exceeded, but it does. The more income, the more satisfied are with their life, especially if they wanted to have income when they were 18 years of age. Huge influence on well-being of and on the effect of income on well-being, of whether you thought that money was important when you were 18 years old. That really tells both how much money you're going to have when you're 45 and how you feel about it.
Interesting. In the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, can you connect thinking more clearly, thinking more aware of the system 1 and system 2 with greater life satisfaction?
I haven't made that connection. I'm not sure it exists.
Okay.
I think life satisfaction is really a judgment about your life. And to a very large extent, it's a conventional judgment. So if your life is conventionally successful, you tend to be satisfied with it. And if you meet your goals, you tend to be satisfied with it. So having the right goals is really important. So money is sort of ambiguous. I can tell you about money because it's fun. It's a 4-point scale that people at age 18 completed. 25 years later, so how important is money to you from 1 to 4? 25 years later, you measure their income, their life satisfaction, everything else. There were something like 1,000 physicians in the sample. Every point on the scale, and that's 15 years ago, was worth $18,000 of income. People who wanted money got more money. Non-working women whose household income is determined by the income of their husband, every point on the scale was worth $12,000. They married richer people if it was important to them. And what happened is the people for whom money was important, if they got it, it made them happier. If they didn't get it, it really made them miserable. The people who said at age 18 that money was not important to them, it really wasn't important to them 25 years later. Their life satisfaction was essentially independent of their income. So it's a complex story.
So I asked this question because I'm very concerned about your wife. You said that you are much better at identifying when people make decisions that are biased, kind of system 1 biased. I wonder if you're a pain in the butt to live with. That you're sticking.
I mean, I have learned something else. I have learned to keep quiet.
So should we do that too? Should we say, oh, my colleague is really making a big error here and a bias, and I don't want this negotiation to blow up. On the other hand,
part of system 2 is knowing when not to speak. So.
Beautiful. So I have one more question, and then we'll break for questions from the audience. In some sense, the work you've done has kind of blown up economics, right? It said, this beautiful mathematical structure that economists sort of stole from physics in the early 20th century has ignored economics as a social science, as a science of human behavior. And historically, as you know, Adam Smith was greatly influenced by the natural philosophers of the time and understanding the human creature, and many other well-known economists. Do you think the work you've done is going to improve economic analysis?
I mean, the word you use, I think, is way too strong. I mean, it hasn't blown up anything. The economist, the ship is sailing on. And they continue to use rationality as an assumption, most of them, because they have to. It makes mathematical life a lot easier.
Great.
There is a movement within economics, behavior economics, and linked to that neuroeconomics, which is your field, which doesn't assume that doesn't assume rationality, and they're trying to do economics without that assumption. I couldn't say without that assumption, with a modified assumption of rationality. They allow pockets of unreason, they allow mistakes. And that seems to be spreading within economics. It's clearly quite respectable. I mean, the Harvard Department of Economics is dominated by it. I think that's fair. Berkeley, it's very salient. So there are important departments of economics where this approach to behavior economics is acceptable. It seems to be spreading. Nobody should predict the future of an academic discipline, and I'm not going to.
And yet there's something, for us, something very addictive about watching real human beings in a controlled setting make economic decisions, or any decisions for that matter, then extracting out the information. So I think one of the errors in economics, how we started this conversation, was this sort of fatal conceit in which I can sit in my office, scribble on a piece of paper, and I can use these, quote, rational decision models to predict what people will do, as opposed to the sort of ground up. Let's put people in a lab, or let's go in the field and watch them, and do that a bunch of times, varied conditions, and then say, oh, here's the way people seem to be doing. And that's, I think, what you introduced to economics and why you rightly deserve the Nobel Prize.
There are many experimental situations in which the principles of economics, people just, by and large, obey the principles of economics. So, people are given a choice between purchasing the same thing at two different prices. Well, they will tend to buy that thing at a lower price. And many predictions of economics are based on simple assumptions of that nature. So economics is very often right. And changes of price have predictable effects, and changes of taxes have predictable effects. They are usually smaller effects and slower effects, and the world is a lot stickier than in many of the economic theories, and that has a lot to do with psychology. But it will be a while before we get a perfect synthesis.
Right, and maybe never. Maybe it's such an organic system because it's human beings that 75% predictive is
75% would be great.
Would be great. Yeah. Now, are you asked to actually weigh in on economic factors? You have a Nobel Prize in economics, and so there must be a tendency for reporters, your friends.
Yeah. That tendency exists, but I have a system too. And I know how to protect myself. I mean, my best friend in economics would really be furious if I started weighing it.
Great. Beautiful.
So I know my place.
Perfect example of system two thinking. So the book is Thinking Fast and Slow. Great pleasure to have you here. And we have about 15 minutes per question, so I think what I've tried to do is sort of prompt you to say some things that will get people thinking, and love to hear what the audience has to say.
I have a question about conflict between System 1 and System 2. In instances in which System 1 trumps System 2. So for example, when you're taking a test, they sometimes say, never go back and correct initial response, because for whatever reason you shouldn't, because your intuition maybe trumps. And what I was wondering is, in instances, say, when you make a decision but you need to justify it to someone else, you can't justify it, the initial decision might have been right. Can you speak to that too?
Yeah. I think there has been a lot of study on whether you should or should not correct your initial guesses. I just heard, I haven't read the studies, I haven't followed. I think the last I heard was it's a good thing not to correct. That actually, unless you specifically remember the correct answer, don't replace one guess by another. That's That's what I heard. Check it in Wikipedia or something. I mean, you're not taking tests, so it doesn't matter if I misled you. Let's see. Now I've lost you again.
So it's on essentially whether you can override System
Yeah.
1.
Whether System 1 actually is better than System 2.
Yeah. Now there are classes of decisions in which clearly System 1 is better than System 2, and you'd better not question yourself. So one of the things, there's a classic experiment where students were asked to choose a poster for their room and were later given a chance to reevaluate their decision and to assess how happy they were. And one group was just encouraged to go with their gut, to take the poster that they thought they liked more. And the other were asked to do a detailed analysis of the two posters and to reach a conclusion about which they should use. And later they checked the satisfaction of the two groups with their decisions. And the first group was happier. So there are situations where, especially when you're sort of anticipating your own emotions, where sometimes System 1 will do a better job than System 2. Not invariably, but it's not the case that analysis is always helpful. There clearly are cases where it is not.
And often when things are rapid, so sports are a good example of that too. So if you're getting killed playing basketball this afternoon, ask the guy who's making every shot, well, how are you holding your hands? And if you make him engage System 2, he's going to play worse, actually.
Oh, a lot. I mean,
Right.
golfers do that deliberately when they want to change their swing. I mean, they think about it.
Right.
And that destroys the current swing.
Right.
In discussion with some colleagues yesterday, we were talking about price versus value. And listening to some of the comments you've had today, it seems that price is kind of a System 2 thing, where value might be more aligned with System 1. Care to comment on that? Is that a sensible?
I think Paul probably knows more about this than I do, because there has been a lot of neuroscience on this. And I think you're right. That is, what I've gathered from that is that price comes in, it's a more, your attitude to the object is very much a System 1 thing, and then price is more of a reflective thing.
I think price is more of a System 1 because evolution is so conservative. Price activates area in the brain associated with pain. So this is a very, very rapid, immediate response. You see that high price. You guys ever get this? You write a really big check, I don't know, down payment for a house, and your hand sweats a little bit. That's a nice System 1 response. It's wow, that's a chunk of money, right? So the value, I think, is something that also we can feel very intuitively, and I think this is, again, one of the big breakthroughs in economics, is that objective value, the price on that, is different than our internal subjective value.
Under what condition do you activate the conflict system? In some of these purchasing experiments, you get a lot of activity of System 2, obviously.
So you can get locked in. I think that's the point. And this is very much this idea of kind of anchoring, even things like the availability bias. So, you hear about this. So this is, Mike Gardner, who was telling me about the investment property he wanted to buy in 2008. And I said, that's the last thing you want to do, right? You're a gardener. Don't buy investment properties, right? But it's so much in the news. Oh, this is going to go up in price. And so, the sort of pain part of this is irrelevant, and it's this set sort of forecasting of value that takes over.
But there is something else which is actually in the news very much these days, that some products activate a lot of emotion. And, that's been said of Apple products, and I think
Absolutely.
correctly.
Right.
And those have a powerful emotional resonance, and you have to have it.
And you love them.
Yeah,
at
and you
some
love
point.
them and you have
Right.
them, and so in that sense, and it's a different attitude than the attitude you have to money.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think. So
I've heard you talk before about assignment of value to money at the age of 18 having a predictive effect on what their life turns out like. Is there any research on what actually sets that preference for the person at age 18? Is it a genetic thing? Is it an environmental thing?
I don't know. It's a fascinating question, and my guess is the answer is they're out there somewhere. I just don't happen to know it. While we're on goals, I can tell you what goals you shouldn't have. I mean, it's too late for you guys, but
Your kids. Right.
there is a goal that is really predictive of low well-being 25 years later, and it's sort of an interesting one. It's the goal of being a performing artist.
Mhm.
People who at age 18 have that as a goal are, by and large, on average, not happy in their 40s. And that's because this is a goal that most people will fail in achieving. And that has a big effect.
So that's why in LA we have so much unhappiness. Failed actors. Let's thank you again so much for coming in. Dr. Daniel Kahneman.